Welcome to Climate Change and Health in Small Island Developing States focused on the Caribbean. If you require translation into Spanish or French, please use the link posted in the chat and choose your desired language at the bottom of the Zoom screen. You should continue to keep this browser open as well to utilize the chat and Q&A features. Please be sure to scroll down and mute the video. Please use the Q&A feature to submit any questions for the panelists. This session is being recorded. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the session 4 on the role of government regulation, in climate change and health in small island developing states. My name is Maisha Hutton, and I'm the Executive Director of the Healthy Caribbean Coalition, and I'm delighted to be your moderator this evening, where we will discuss and explore how policy, legislation, regulation, and Indigenous voices can influence the changes needed to address the effects of climate change on health and health systems within and outside of the health sector. The Healthy Caribbean Coalition we're very pleased to be here today because this idea of using the law as a tool to affect change at the population level is something very close to our heart. And I'm really excited to hear discussion today around a research agenda in which we can start to think about what are those policies that we need to prioritize that can achieve double and duty impacts across both health and climate mitigation. We have a wonderful panel today, and I'm really excited to introduce each of them to you. I'm going to provide a brief bio. If you're keen to learn more about them, you can visit the conference website to read their detailed bios. Let me start with Rashad Brathwaite and Carlin Mendoza. Rashad Brathwaite is an attorney at law and an academic, and he is currently a junior research fellow at the Faculty of Law at the University of West Indies Cave Hill campus. He is a graduate of UE and University of Warwick's International Development Law and Human Rights program. Carlin is an attorney at law and a legal consultant and is currently the research officer at the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. He is also a graduate of UE and a University of Reading's International Law with Development program, as well as Chevening alum. We are pleased to have the Honorable Mr. Justice Winston Anderson on the panel today. He is a judge of the Caribbean Court of Justice, or the CCJ, and chairman of the CCJ Academy for Law. He has an LLB from the University of the West Indies and a PhD from Cambridge University. We also have Ms. Akila Jaramogi with us. She is the co-founder and CEO of Fonzaman's Community Reforestation Project in St. Anne's, Trinidad and Tobago. And she is a director of the Maroon Women Chapter of Corporation in the Caribbean. And finally, we are delighted to have with us today, Ms. Yazinia, or Dr. Mazinia Linares Vega, who is here on behalf of Dr. Jesus Duran. Dr. Vega is a meteorologist of the Institute of Meteorology of Cuba and a researcher in climate and human health, specifically in models of spatial prediction of infectious diseases and agent circulation from climate conditions. So before we get started, I wanted to remind everyone to use the Q&A function while you hear the presentations. Please feel free to answer those, to present questions, and our panelists will respond in real time to some of those questions. Rashad and Carlin are going to get started with their presentation now on navigating an interlocking crisis, a roadmap for the Caribbean at the intersection of public health and climate emergencies. Rashad and Carlin, over to you.
Thank you so much, Maisha. It's an absolute pleasure to discuss this afternoon with you, navigating interlocking crisis legalities, a roadmap for the Caribbean at the intersections of public health and climate emergencies. And in our presentation, we emphasize the legal dimension, the legal regimes, and we start from the perspective that there is indeed a profound existential connection between these disparate areas, despite their often existence within the legal world as silos. And so we then explore the international law and domestic law domains of the climate change, natural disaster, and public health regimes. And then we're going to focus in on the case study of unsolicited bilateral donations as an example of the ways in which these agendas, they must come together. And then we sum up and provide a brief roadmap for action, or at least a modest research agenda. And so what we see in reality is the existential crises And with the increase in global warming and related natural hazards, we also have the existence within the Caribbean context of multiple public health crises, and we're particularly interested in SIDS. And climate change then, of course, having intersecting relationships with these two other domains. And so we see a variety of legal regimes governing these disparate areas. And we are seeking to raise the question of the possibilities of regime collision, even in the midst of weak fragments. To use Justice Anderson's language, can these weak weapons be used to attack what is indeed a strong fortress? And so we see 5 related legal frameworks and some soft law declarations that we're interested in seeing the ways in which they can be mobilized to address these interlocking crisis legalities. And so what is the real world connection? So at the global level, then, as regulated by the UNFCCC, we see, and then the global commitments and the extent of global commitments or non-fulfillment of obligations, we know that poor management of the environment can lead to disasters with significant effects, direct and indirect, for health. Of course, this is cyclical, and so this produces more natural hazards, which can lead to poorer health and environmental outcomes. And so if we think of the context of NCDs within the Caribbean, poorer health outcomes can make it harder for individuals to navigate individual disasters, but also there's a significant strain on health systems. So if we think of the context of COVID-19, the ways in which the health system writ large has been put under strain. So whether that looks like inability to access preventative care, which could save, the stitch in time saves time. And so we note then that there are 3 related connections between disaster and health, and these can be direct ecosystem mediated and human institution mediated. Very quickly, when we speak about direct effects, we're talking about increases in the intensity of storms. When we talk about ecosystem mediated, we're talking about changes in the distribution and burden of vector-borne diseases such as dengue. And then we talk about human institution mediated, we're talking about undernutrition, and in our context, we might be talking about failures in the supply chain.
So taking over from Rashad, we're looking at health in climate change. And the international climate change law primarily consists of the Kyoto Protocol to the UNFCCC. And what we'll notice in that convention is that it addresses the adverse effects of climate change and encourages states to promote and cooperate in scientific, technological, and socioeconomic research to reduce uncertainties regarding climate change, as well as accounting for their common but differentiated responsibilities. So it is a very important document. And as Rashad had stated earlier, in terms of soft law and how now we can manipulate those responsibilities or obligations and influence other important aspects such as human health and public health. But importantly, health is not even mentioned in the protocol, to the extent where it's only mentioned when it comes to special climate funds or the adaptation funds, where money is needed to promote the research around the area. And as such, we'll turn to the fact that some academics have argued that health is not protected in climate change law, because this law focuses on the stabilizing of greenhouse gases, as well as commitments by states, and it doesn't even establish definitive rules for public health sectors, as well as it's only mentioned in mitigation measures and not in adaptation measures. So it doesn't focus on how we can leverage what we know as public health, what we know as the right to health, which Rashad will get to, and how we can use that to assist us in combating or fighting climate change. However, there's a nexus which can be established between public health and climate change. And it is important for us to know that the discussion around climate change brings environmentalists and businesses and policymakers to the table with the primary goal of preserving both human and planetary health. So we still have opportunities where we can tap into climate change law and influence the effect or the benefits of public health. Rashad?
All right, and so I'll very briefly cover the right to health as represented in Caribbean constitutionalism, and Justice Anderson will speak to the right to healthy environment. But what we broadly see is that the right to health is weakly protected in Caribbean constitutionalism, but we suggest that there are, if we look again, that we may see indirect rights such as the right to life, as had been nodded to by the Caribbean Courts of Justice in Nervé and Severin, and then some international law jurisprudence. Equally, with Caribbean courts now moving to more holistic readings of the Constitution, we suggest there is a possibility for grounding the right to health in the Caribbean Constitution, even in the midst of the weak text. We note then that global practices demonstrate evolving approaches with increasing norm migration between various judiciaries, with the grand effect of significant erosion of dualism, such that the international treaty obligations which Caribbean states have largely committed to, that they now represent potentially much more usable concepts within domestic law. And so we see some of the examples of the uses of international law, and Justice Anderson will cover some of those. But in effect, then, we suggest that human rights represents a connecting mechanism that can be used both to create policy pressure on the part of the state, but can also give the state policy space to take measures in the interest of public health, climate change, and to address natural disasters, but also then allows a securitizing mechanism whereby the state could defend the measures adopted under its policy space. Equally, human rights provides a framework for participatory approaches, which we suggest in the context of the rising levels of NCDs, that equally the state must consider the approaches and perspectives of persons living with NCDs. So how does this then all come together in the context of unsolicited bilateral donations?
So to integrate a live example, there was a case study recently concluded in Bahamas that dealt with the solicitation of goods, whether it be unsolicited donations, to persons after the aftermath of Hurricane Dorian. And in that instance, what we clearly saw there was the needs of certain goods, whether it fell into the category of evaluating their nutritional value in terms of giving what is needed. And in essence, it is clear how we're going to integrate health into our lived reality of facing and dealing with disasters. We must pay attention to the types of goods and services and foodstuff and items that are donated. So this is something that we can chart a course forward in terms of protecting, as Rashad spoke about, the NCDs and protecting our citizens and ensuring that they have a healthy lifestyle, even in the midst of a disaster.
And then jumping on to that, we also then have to plan for healthcare in the context of disaster. What then does provision of services for persons living with HIV look like in the after effect of hurricanes in the stigmatized environment that Caribbean states have not yet fully addressed? And so we suggest that on multiple levels, there's a space for states to act consistent with their international human rights law obligations, even in the context of disaster, which then will have significant impacts on the quality of life of citizens. And so we then come to bringing it back to rights. And so we identify rights as a vocabulary for struggle that can be used to inspire action, and equally as a shield for measures when taken as a command, not just for areas that may be before the courts, but as a paradigm. We suggest then that this integration makes obvious sense. Carlin?
Yes, and quickly moving on, we would like to see health considerations integrated into climate change and disaster risk reduction laws and policies within our Caribbean that assist with international disaster response law.
And equally then as Caribbean states navigate the international law dimensions and foreign international relations, pressure using the climate change space to make claims for the right to health, ultimately then speaking to a coherent policy at the international and domestic level. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Excellent. Thank you, Rashad and Carlin. I'm going to hand over now to Justice Anderson to share perspectives on this role of government in climate health. Justice Anderson, over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yes, and I assume you can also see my screen?
We can see you. We can't see your slides as yet.
Oh, there. Sorry, is there any way that you can assist me with the slides that you have?
Yes, I think so. Just give us one moment.
Sure, thank you. And while that is being done, colleagues, may I say it's my very great pleasure to be with you to discuss a topic which is of existential importance to all of us, especially in the era in which we are now living in the context of the pandemic. There is obviously a very intricate and very important linkage between health and the environment, and I think that linkage is being teased out by the platform on which we are all embarked on this afternoon. My very few minutes, and they are going by very quickly, will be spent trying to give a broad perspective on the Caribbean and the Caribbean's approach to health and the environment. Traditionally, as we are all aware, climate change regulation is treated separate and apart from the protection of public health. And this point was made earlier that the bifurcation exists in the international treaties, even at the very genesis of concern for human rights and the environment. These subjects are treated quite differently in various silos of treaties on environment versus those on health. There has been an excellent Caribbean uptake in the acceptance of both sets of treaties, both those on the environment and those on health. But our governmental regulation reflects this bifurcation so that the regulation of health is treated quite separate and apart usually from regulation of the environment and climate change, for example. And that's one of the things I wanted to point out. And then secondly, that there is an implementation deficit as regards the Caribbean's approach to the regulation of health and the environment, because whereas we have, as countries in the region, accepted very many international agreements, very many international treaties, these are not always implemented within our domestic sphere as they should be. I wanted to give you some good news though, and that is that in recent times, there seems to be emerging signs of linkage between health and the environment within our regulatory space in the region, and that's very, very promising. But the implementation deficit remains a problem. And then finally, I wanted to say a word about a recent development in the region, that is to say the formation of a Caribbean Public Health Forum, which brings together disciplines from law, from health, other disciplines as well, into a common space to discuss how common problems can be tackled. So I hope we're at the point where we could go to slide 3 and I could look very briefly at the situation as regards the human rights treaties and how they have been accepted or not. And the answer basically is that they have been very, very largely supported by Caribbean states, as you see here. And I think there are 15 countries in all. We're missing Trinidad and Tobago at the end. But all 15 of our member states have accepted the basic human rights treaties, which they are, and have participated, obviously, in some cases in their formation. Now, one of the things that was said by the speaker just before me is that these treaties don't, generally speaking, deal with the environment. They are focused on civil and political rights and economic and social rights, and they rarely touch upon environmental concerns. There is a mention of the environment in the International Covenant on Economic and Civil Covenant, Social and Cultural Rights, 1966, and also in the San Salvador Protocol. But basically, they do not, in fact, touch on the environment. They are simply concerned with human rights. So if we go to the next slide, you will see here that there are also interesting responses to the conventions on the environment and on climate change in particular. Once again, there is a fairly solid wall of acceptance by our 15 member states of the various conventions which pertain to climate change. But again, as the speaker before me said, these conventions don't usually deal with health. There's sometimes a reference in the preamble. I think there's a reference in the preamble to the UNFCCC to the right or to the obligation to protect health. But in general terms, they're not really concerned with health. They are concerned with the environment. So if we go to the next slide, and this is what I mean by the implementation deficit. So we have a situation where both silos of treaties have been widely supported by Caribbean states, but the implementation of them within the national space is problematic. And one of the problems, I believe, for this is the doctrine of dualism, again hinted at earlier, and that is to say that these treaties accepted by our Caribbean states do not have the force of law within the Caribbean. They have to be implemented, incorporated by an act of parliament before they can be relied upon by our citizens in our jurisdictions. Haiti and Suriname provide some limited exceptions to this, but as a general rule, that in fact is the case. And it was illustrated very powerfully in that case, NRCA against Seafood and Ting, 1999, dealing with the CITES Convention, where it was held that although Jamaica had in fact ratified the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, that convention could not govern relations within Jamaica because it had not been accepted by the Parliament of Jamaica. Now, the legislative uptake of these various treaties is not as impressive as the pattern of acceptance I described to you earlier. Whilst we have accepted very many treaties, they have not always been incorporated by our legislatures. As far as the human rights treaties are concerned, the Constitutional Bill of Rights, I think, is fairly important and fairly useful in ensuring that Caribbean citizens enjoy political and civil rights. And these statements of rights have been developed, of course, by all of our courts, from the first instance court all the way up to the Privy Council and the CCJ, as the case may be. But as far as the environmental treaties are concerned, it's very, very rare to find legislation that is dedicated only to, let us say, climate change. Very, very unusual. What is more usual is to find a reference to climate change in framework conventions. These are conventions which are concerned with the general regulation of the environment. And within that space, there is sometimes a reference to environmental protection against climate change. And that is the case, for example, in the Environmental Management Act 2000 of Trinidad and Tobago, and in the Environmental Protection and Management Act 2019 of Antigua and Barbuda. Now, that is a very important development because in these statutes, where there is regulation of climate change issues, then the institutional apparatus provided for in the statute becomes available to enforce these standards dealing with climate change. So that's a very, very welcome development. In one or two other instances, there's no mention or no provision for climate change as such in the broad environmental statute, but there is what we call incorporation by reference, which is a sort of a way around the dualism. What happens is that there's a provision in the statute which by reference says that the Climate Change Convention, could be the UN Framework Convention, could be the Kyoto Protocol, is hereby considered to be part of the law of the land. And a very good example of that is provided by the Environmental Protection Act in St. Kitts and Nevis. Now that's a very, very useful approach. It does not require a lot of, say, legislative resources, obviously. It's just a single paragraph often. And that serves to provide the bridge to facilitate the application of these international treaties. The difficulty with that, of course, is that the mere statement that the treaty has the force of law within the jurisdiction doesn't solve all the problems, because it does not by itself create the institutional support for the enforcement of the laws. It doesn't provide for the human resources that will be required or the management systems that will be required to enforce the laws. So it's useful to say, yes, it's part of the law of the land, but then it also requires institutional or other levels of support to make sure that the climate change treaty is practically applicable within the jurisdiction. So there remains a very serious implementation deficit in the region. Next slide, please. Now, as I promised you, a little good news, and that is that increasingly our jurisdictions are recognizing the linkage between health and the environment. And I have quoted for you 4 constitutional provisions which touch on that linkage, constitutional provisions in Guyana, Cayman Islands, Jamaica, and the British Virgin Islands. Guyana, just to take one example, there's a provision that everyone has the right to an environment that is not harmful to his health or well-being. And with that kind of provision, of course, the courts have some leeway to develop the jurisprudence on what is required to ensure that there is support between a healthy environment and the right to health. Next slide. There's also a linkage which is increasingly being made between health and the environment, between climate change and health in the judicial decisions around the world, not just in the Caribbean. In fact, as you may know, there was a recent report from the United Nations Environment Program 2021 discussing the number of cases which have been brought in several countries to cement that link in the judicial mind between climate change and the right to health. So in 2017, 884 cases were brought in 24 countries. And in 2020, almost a doubling of that, 1,550 cases in 38 countries. And many of these cases have succeeded. They have been premised on the understanding that violations of climate rights involve violations of fundamental rights, including the right to health, food, and water. Very, very important development, one that we are watching in the Caribbean very closely. There are 1 or 2 cases from the Caribbean that have sought to begin to make that linkage, and I've mentioned a couple of those there. The Sardine case against AG of Trinidad and Tobago, and fishermen, again, friends of the sea. I see time has come to end. I go just, if you permit me one last second, to the last slide, which is just making the point that there is a Caribbean Public Health Forum which has been established, and that is a very, very important development because it brings together different professionals from all the disciplines to speak about that connection, health and climate change. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Justice Anderson. And we can use the Q&A portion for you to talk more about the law forum. We now like to go to Akila, who is going to present, hello? Yes, on civil society and NGOs' actions towards a cleaner and greener planet. Over to you, Akila.
Thank you. Greetings, everyone, and it's really a privilege to be here with you all to share what my NGO, what we have been doing over the years at Fonzaman here, to ensure that we all enjoy greener planet, greener community, and healthier lives. So I'm just going to share with you from and next slide, thanks. Yeah, so a little bit about us. Fonzaman Community Reforestation Project, for those who know Trinidad well. We are situated 10 minutes away from the Savannah, downtown Port of Spain. So here we are in a suburban community, and it's really, a space that both my late husband and I, Takma Jaramugi, founded, and looking at community-based agroforestry initiative as we address the bush and forest fires in the hills here. Fonzaman is dedicated to environmental conservation and community development. Over the years, we have planted over 100,000 seedlings in the hills here, which have eventually converted a fire climax zone into a now healthy agroforestry project. And this did not just come about by us saying, oh, we just want to do it, but looking at the need to transform a space, looking at the need to heal Mother Earth, looking at the need to interrupt a pattern of environmental degradation. So here, over 30 years, we have been, championing the part of caring for this watershed. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thanks. Yeah. Okay, so here I'm going to show you some of the, can you go back? Thanks. Some of the modules that we have worked with. Next. Yes, thanks. Yeah, over the years in building a model community and agroforestry project. So what we did as a community, both Takuma and I and members of our community, we looked at addressing forest fire prevention, reforestation, river ecology, conservation, organic gardening, ecotourism, composting, craft and cottage industry, music and culture, and community, which is most of all the people in our community. So here you can see where the photos there over the years, the photos of forest fires in the hills, and the action of the community becoming custodians of their natural environment to transform spaces like this into the photo you are seeing lower, that green hillside, So these are some of the models, these are some of the modules that we have introduced in the community here, while, our main objective is to see a green forest cover and convert, human behavior into a more caring, loving community. Next. Next slide, please. Thanks. Yeah. So again, looking at civil society and NGOs as we stand as beacon of change and champions of the environment, what it means to be that, civil society and NGO have maintained democracy, by being catalysts for development and betterment. Again, by fostering cooperative conduct as key players in achieving equitable, sustainable, and inclusive development goals. And again, this did not come, easy. You have to truly understand, and understand how to measure what is happening in your environment. And so again, to be a champion of the environment is converting, patterns. It's converting a space. It's working with your people. And again, looking at NGOs, civil societies, coming together and being watchdogs, coming together and being, caretakers, coming together and interrupting negative patterns. So here in one of the photos, I am in Fiji planting mangroves, and another one, the photo on top is where we have an event called the GAIAP, where we bring people together for a positive cause, which is to fight forest fires. But not that alone, it's getting government stakeholders as well involved, and addressing situations where we see, the state failed to address. Next. So again, ever so often you talk about NGO doing the work, and sometimes they tend to fail to interact with state agencies. At Fonzaman, we see the importance of networking. We use networking as one of the most powerful tools within our organization, to share information and to achieve some of our goals. So here you would see not just local, but regional and international outreach. We have been, able to connect with a lot of NGOs in the Caribbean. We have been able to work with a lot of NGOs at home here in Trinidad, and also tap into the state agencies as well, be it ODPM, looking at disasters, be it EMA, be it IMA, Forestry Division. We see them as important stakeholders. So whatever laws or whatever policies that they have to guide them, we try our best to make some kind of input. Ever so often they would send, I'm talking about the state, would send policies to us, policies documents for us to review and so on, and add that touch. And for us, it's the NGO voices that is so important, because we are the ones on the ground. We are the ones who sometimes are the first responders to situations. So therefore, I place myself and my organization in a space where, we can have a voice, and be it nominated or selected to be on state board, or to be out there as advocates, for the environment, and not afraid to go to the state agencies who are responsible for doing the work and ensure that they do it. So again, our group is wide, our supporters are wide, and I encourage other NGOs to not be afraid to reach out, and also to the education sector as well. For us, we work closely with the universities and colleges and schools, so that the information, traditional knowledge can be passed on to the generations.
Hi,
Thanks.
Akila. Just wanted to
Hi.
ask you to wrap up. You've got if you can wrap up in the next 30 seconds or so.
Okay.
Thank you.
Next slide, please. Yes, so again, this is action. This is the kind of people we get together to make it happen. Next slide. Again, when you come in the forest, this is what we do. Next. Yes, so again, way forward is just for me, for the decision makers and lawmakers. What I want to say is to make sure that you do your work. Make sure that you say you deliver. Make sure that those laws and policies that you have, make sure that they are enforced. And we are here as civil society groups to go after you all, go after the state, and make sure that the work is done. Thank you.
Thank you, Akila. That was excellent. And we can perhaps have some time in the Q&A to circle back on some of your way forward comments. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Vega. We're going to hear a presentation, a pre-recorded presentation.
Hello, my name is Yesenia Linares Vega. I am a meteorologist, researcher, and member of the Cuban Climate Health Group. Dr. Duran asked me to make his presentation because he is outside the province, mobilized attending a region complicated with COVID, and unfortunately, he will not be able to be here today. He apologizes to them. Well, the intervention is about government adaptation plan of climate change on health sector in Cuba. Learn lessons. Cuba as a signatory United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Incorporation as a signatory to the UNFCCC has presented it three national communication result of the study vulnerability adaptation assessment to climate variability and change, initiated in the 1990 by the Climate Center of the Institute of Meteorology, together with the National Institute of Tropical Medicine, Hygiene and Epidemiology. Studies conducted in the country confirm that as a result of variability anomalies and climate changes in recent years in Cuba, there is a short and medium term decrease in case number and medical care visits for various diseases and increasing the risk of transmission, such as acute respiratory infections caused by the respiratory syncytial and influenza virus, acute diarrheal diseases caused by bacterial enteropathogens, Salmonella and Escherichia coli, chickenpox, dengue fever, and other arbovirosis diseases. According to the previous evidence, climate change impact is recognized as one of the main environmental problems in Cuba, as reflected in the National Environmental Strategy 2016 to 2020. As a consequence, the strategy itself recognizes the effective implementation of action to face climate change, prioritizing adaptation measures as one of its objectives. On 25 April 2017, the state plan for confronting climate change, called Text Life, constitutes a comprehensive action plan composed of 5 strategic actions and 11 texts, which are shown. For example, reduce vulnerability in the 14 prioritized areas of the country, recover sandy beaches, protect soils and waters, and recover mangrove, rehabilitate and preserve coral reefs, and implement adaptation measures related to food, energy, land, and urban planning, fishing, agriculture, health, tourism, construction, transportation, industry, and comprehensive forest management. The Ministry of Public Health has prioritized research into climate change and health and provides the political will and guidance taking sectorial and ministerial approach to the problem. And to implement the strategy, the health sector, starting from the point of the state, to initiate the elaboration of the National Adaptation Plan in the sector. As part of the preparation of the plan, some of measures, activities, and line of work for impact, vulnerability, and adaptation assessment related to the identified health sector are shown on the slide. For example, to continue developing the baseline in health, referring to those diseases and agents that are linked to climate variability and change, establishing the current distribution and burden of those, identify recent trends, incidence, and frequency of other viruses, e.g. SARS-CoV-2. Organizing the information system that allows establishing environmental health diagnosis. Development of public health action plan based on early warning system that allow the identification of risk situations before they occur. Development of a specific surveillance and a control programs for agent and disease related to climate variability and change. Also, some line of research has been identified as shown in the slide. For example, evaluation on the effect of climate change on health, taking into account the projection of the country's demographic structures and the influence of other sectors under the different climate change scenarios. Integrate vulnerability and adaptation studies identified and prioritizing vulnerable areas and or sectors in the country. Calculations on cost of adaptation of health sector to associate with variability and climate change. To respond to the above need, Cuba proposed to this from the creation of Observatory Climate Health, which provides an analysis tool, diagnosis, evaluation, and research continues of the effect of the variability and climate change in the health before a changing climate, and where the adaptation measures will be generated with their corresponding evaluation of benefit cost. Finally, we would like to make two comments, which in our opinion are not only a necessity for Cuba, but we consider that it will also be useful for the region, and that as shown refers to the collaboration in the centers and the creation of the regional observatory. Well, thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Vega, for that presentation. So we don't have much time left in the session, just about 2 minutes. We had a question on the implementation deficit and how we can address this implementation deficit. And it's not unique to this area of climate change. It's something which is a chronic issue across the Caribbean. And I would dare say one of the approaches there needs to be around priority setting and identifying what those priorities are. And research will help us to bring us closer to identifying priorities so we can invest resources. And I also think that Justice Anderson's The Caribbean Public Health Forum is an excellent example of a multi-stakeholder forum in which we can start to identify what research priorities are and leverage the expertise of various stakeholders in charting out that agenda. So I'd like to thank all of the panelists today for coming together for this excellent panel. Thank you for inviting us, and I'm going to close now as we are approaching the end of the session. Thank you all.